Hello and welcome to Student Affairs Live, the online learning community for student affairs educators. I am your host, Heather Shea Gasser from Michigan State University. I use she, her, hers pronouns. Today we're talking about and critically reflecting on white people messing up in conversations about race and social justice in student affairs. We welcome your comments, questions, and participation. Follow along on the back channel and tweet to our hashtag HigherEdLive. As always, thank you to my friend, Alex Sylvester, for helping me out with our back channel today. In a moment, I'll introduce you to the 7 incredible panelists who have joined me today, but first I need to acknowledge and thank those who make Student Affairs Live possible. Student Affairs Live is a part of the Higher Ed Live network. You can tune in to episodes with my friend and co-host, the amazing Tony Duty, and me on Wednesdays at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. If you're unfamiliar with past episodes, we highly recommend that you check out and favorite the archive link that we're tweeting out. Higher Ed Live is produced by Stoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. Stoner is offering a free webinar on analytics for digital storytelling on September 28th. Analytics provide us with vital information to track and measure audience behavior so we can extend the reach and impact of our storytelling efforts across all of our communications channels. Join Stoner for this webinar to get your analytics game on. Registration is free and we're tweeting out a link shortly where you can sign up. Student Affairs Live is also exclusively sponsored by ACPA, College Student Educators International. ACPA says they are pleased to support Student Affairs Live, one of the many ways you can be innovative with your professional development delivery. Visit www.myacpa to discover the next way that you can engage with your own personal and professional development. ACPA provides a special institute for aspiring senior student affairs officers. Registration is now open for the November program, and please visit the link that we're tweeting out now to register for that. Now on with today's topic. Today's episode was prompted by my own mess up, or mess ups, plural is maybe better. And I'm going to share a little bit about that story in a moment. And I also want to acknowledge that the respect and admiration I have for the colleagues and friends who have directly engaged with me in conversations about these mistakes, which have occurred within and beyond the context of this particular outlet, Higher Ed Live, and more broadly in my personal and professional life. Credit in particular goes to one of the other members of the panel today, Craig Elliott, who encouraged this episode as a model for conversation about white people messing up. So I and all of the members of today's panel identify as white. We hold other intersecting identities, but today we're focusing on our positionality as white people in particular. We are, however, conscious that we are not speaking for all white people. And I also acknowledge that voices and perspectives may be missing from this panel. Yet, in an attempt to bring as many voices and perspectives as possible, we have engaged a very large panel today, 7 individuals who have all enthusiastically agreed with the premise of this episode to share stories of our mess-ups. So we'll approach today's topic with a great deal of vulnerability, publicly sharing our recollections of events that have evoked feelings that run the gamut from unease to full-blown shame is not done without trepidation. So I'm grateful to the other 7 folks who are joining me today. As each panelist introduce themselves, please visit our website to read about all of the amazing things that they do in their detailed bios. So panelists, welcome. Please, as you introduce yourselves, share any relevant details about you that are related to today's topic. And we are going to start with Craig Alamo.
Good morning. I'm Craig John Alamo. I'm the relatively new director for equity and inclusivity at Napa Valley College, a 2-year institution in California in wine country. I've been a social justice educator for a number of years and have particular interests around ally development and intergroup dialogue in particular.
Excellent. Thanks, Craig. Elaine. Oh, Elaine, I can't hear you very well.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. I'm Elaine Brigham, sorry about that. And I'm also interested in intergroup dialogue and ran an intergroup dialogue program at Mount Holyoke College with my dear colleague, Dr. Tanya Williams, for about 10 years. I'm also finishing up my doctorate in social justice education at UMass Amherst, where I also work in the Dean of Students office as case manager and do lots of social justice consulting and facilitating and that kind of thing. I'm so glad to be on the call.
Thank you so much for being here, Elaine. Stephanie.
Thanks, Heather. My name is Stephanie Bondi. I use the pronouns she, her, hers. I think it's important to name some of my other privileged identities. I identify as cisgender and being from an upper middle class background. I'm a faculty member teaching in student affairs at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. My scholarship and teaching focus on power and oppression.
Thanks, Stephanie, for being here. Keith.
Yeah, my name is Keith Edwards. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm a speaker, consultant, and coach. I work primarily with college campuses around sexual violence prevention, social justice education, men's identity, and things like that. And previously, I was at McAllister College for 8 years as the director of campus life, and I'm looking forward to the conversation very much.
Thanks for being here so much, Keith. I appreciate it. Okay, other Craig Elliott.
Yes, so Craig Elliott, he, him, his. Practitioner for 24 years in student affairs, goodness gracious, and a budding scholar and trainer. Social justice education has been a part of my career and some of my consultant work for the last 15 years in trying to help shape a better world and what white people can do to do our part in that. So just honored to be here with this amazing group, and thank you.
Jessica.
Hi, my name is Jessica Pettit, and I worked on a number of college campuses, primarily doing res life, multicultural LGBT services, and have been speaking or doing my own consulting work now for almost 10 years, which is mind-boggling to me, and I'm really excited to be here. And I think specifically in light of a few months ago, the SA Pro blackout and some of the other conversations that have been happening on Twitter and in Facebook, I think it's a really great opportunity to talk about well-intended white people and what we do. So thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. And Beth.
Hello, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. I'm Beth. I use she, her, hers. I like to say that I have my roots in student affairs, but have done most of my work in nonprofit agencies. And so I have a lot of background in training, but currently I'm in development, or that's a fancy way of saying fundraising. And also feel very fortunate to be on the board of the Privilege Institute, which runs the White Privilege Conference, and part of Social Justice Training Institute, or SJTI.
Excellent. Again, all of you are incredible. I appreciate you being here. So let me tell you a little bit about the format for today. Those of you who are watching live, this format is going to differ from past episodes. So in the spirit of openness and vulnerability, and as both facilitator and somewhat as participant, I'm going to share a few details of my own story, and then I'm going to pass it to Craig Elliott and each of the other folks on our panel. We're each going to give a personal account, hopefully within a 3 to 5 minute time frame, and talk about our critical reflection upon that particular incident. I also want to encourage us as a panel to have dialogue among each other. And so after the stories that we share, we're going to just open it up for general conversation. My hope is that folks who are watching live on Twitter will engage us as well, ask questions, tweet your comments, and as we can incorporate those, we definitely will. So let me start with just a little bit about what prompted this episode today. As many of you know, if you watch Student Affairs Live of the past several episodes, earlier this summer I hosted an episode about the mass shooting in Orlando, and with the other folks who planned that episode, failed to include on that panel a Latinx voice. we became aware of that pretty quickly, and actually Stephanie Bondi was on that show as well with me. And my immediate reaction was to go into fix-it mode. Stephanie and I had a phone conversation or email conversation. I had an email conversation with Keith Edwards. And, you know, I'm not sure that that was the right approach. It's possible that within my place of privilege and within, you know, my opportunity as host, I'm like, I can just do another episode. I can put together a panel of Latinx people. Regardless of how that ended up, because I think that did provide a space, I'm curious about how other white people might have responded in that same moment of realizing a mistake. And so the particular incident for me brought up issues of perfectionism, you know, sitting in kind of a moment of not feeling good about what I had done or didn't do in this case. And then wanting to act within my sphere of control to make it better. And ultimately, who did that benefit, right? That made me feel better, but did it really make the situation better? So I am grateful to all of you for sharing the examples that you have. That's just one of many, many stories from my background, but one that's particularly relevant to this show. So Craig Elliott, I'm gonna pass it to you next.
Thanks, Heather. So in my trying to figure out on my long list of messes, which one I wanted to show and talk about and which one was more meaningful. And so my story today is about a time when I did not step up for a colleague and a friend of mine in the midst of a situation around a social justice conversation. And to paraphrase Dante's levels of purgatory, I would say this was number 6 on 1 to 9, because this idea of not showing up and not being present and visible and speaking up, I think it happens too much. But it's also, these are relationship ending kinds of situations. And so I want to be able to hold that. So the short version of my story, I was co-training with a friend and colleague of mine, and we've got a career based upon some training that we do together, as well as professional practice in student affairs. And in that training on social justice, my colleague, who's a woman of color, multiracial woman of color, she was attacked and challenged by a white woman in that situation. And in that, when she was being challenged, I did not interrupt. I did not stand up. I let that that situation go on too long, and I did not use my power as a white person to engage the other white person with a conversation on why she was challenging a woman of color about the content and not the man of color or the white man who had actually presented it. And so lots of dynamics swirling around, and my own kind of critical reflection about that. You know, I froze, and I was afraid. I didn't know how to intervene. I didn't know what to do. I was afraid of stepping on toes of my colleague. And so all that stuff was swirling around that led to inaction on my part. And upon deeper reflection, I also realized too that there was my own baggage there. My own personal baggage that I needed to sort through, as well as my own fear of showing up and taking risks when it mattered. And one of my other deeper reflections too in that was that realizing that this is how colonization has shown up in me. That I have that I've incorporated all of this learning and teaching, and found ways that it's benefited from me. And that was a moment where I could have interrupted that, and I didn't. So to echo what Heather does, there was a lot of time sitting in my mess, and lots of good conversations with my colleague who felt betrayed, and I felt like I betrayed her too. And so we have done work to heal on that, but my job is to make sure that that doesn't happen again. And so I really lean on Howard Zinn's title of his autobiography, that we can't be neutral on a moving train. And so it's really up to me to make sure that I'm actively interrupting and ensuring that my whiteness is not preventing me from showing up.
Thanks, Craig. Keith.
Yeah, I think I wanted to mention a story that had happened similar in a training that I was leading, and I think it's important to point out I was leading a training on aspiring ally identity development and how allies can do better, which is a particularly important and ironic time to mess up. I think it gave some good things to model. So one of the things I was doing as part of this training was talking about how allies need to shift from seeing feedback as something to be defensive about when they mess up and see it as a gift towards their own liberation. And it's a really powerful thing for me to think about when I am, my mess ups are either noticed by me or called out by others, that it's easy for me to feel defensive. I do that really well and justify it. But if I can shift to saying, you know, this is a way for me to better understand my own internalized racism, I'm much better about it. So I was giving this talk to a large group of students and some staff and talking about all of my many privileged identities, which is an important part of that. And I was ending with a favorite quote of mine by Cornel West about not being optimistic, but being hopeful. Optimism doesn't require evidence, or optimism requires evidence and hope doesn't, and the power of hope, which is just so critical to, for me, to a liberation approach. And explaining the quote and introducing it, I referred to Cornel West as this brilliant Black man and gave all of his credentials and things that he has done, and someone who I respect so highly, and which I had done in that training for years. And afterwards, one of the people came up and said, you know, I have a gift toward my own liberation, towards your own liberation. And I got defensive. I felt defensive and sort of quickly noticed that because I was really on my game and said, oh, yeah, I really want to hear this. And the woman said, why does he have to be a brilliant Black man and not just brilliant? And I said, yeah, you're totally right. So I didn't get defensive, which is usually in that moment, that inclination to be defensive, my inclination to say that's not really what I meant, that's not what I intended, right, which is something that often happens. My inclination to establish my own credibility, my inclination then to say, oh, yeah, I did mess up. That's true. Why do I do that? But just to accept it. And I think in looking back on that, I did refer to him as a brilliant Black man because in my head, that's how my brain has categorized him. That's how when that was pointed out, it helped move that implicit bias that's back there that I can't control. It's maybe unconscious or subconscious. And it made it an explicit bias, which is painful and embarrassing. But once it's explicit, I can wrestle with it. Whereas where it's implicit, I can't. And for me, it's really, my challenge is not being defensive and sorting through the guilt versus the shame. And, you know, I came to this through Brene Brown. I think Jay Smooth's video about how to tell someone they're racist is another great example. But for me, guilt is I've done something bad, and shame is I am bad. And when you have those definitions, guilt is super helpful. It's powerful. And I felt really guilty, and I want to cultivate my guilt. That was a bad thing to say. I messed up. That feels icky. I don't want to move past that. I want to feel that emotion of guilt, but I don't want to into shame like I'm a horrible human being, I'm a horrible white person, I'm a horrible social justice educator, but that is counterproductive to learning. So how do we simultaneously cultivate in ourselves these feelings of guilt when we've messed up, but not shame? And I think that's a challenge, but to think about our behaviors and what we've done. And I think it's particularly challenging when we both internally and externally really care about these issues, because then it's easier to feel shame. There are lots of people in the world who express a lot of racist things and have no shame about it whatsoever and no guilt. And I want to be someone who, when I mess up, I want to feel guilty about it. But I've got to be careful not to shift over into feeling shame. So.
Thanks so much, Keith, for sharing that story. We're having a few internet issues, so hopefully everything is good. Stephanie, you're next.
All right. Well, here's my story. I was participating in a workshop about diversity and equity, and one of my colleagues and one was facilitating the topic. About 5 minutes into the presentation, I was reading the slide she was showing, and I thought I saw an error in the slide. And so I raised my hand and I said, last night, did you mean And she acknowledged my question very nicely and kept moving on with the presentation. I just sat there because I knew I had done it again, my racist behavior. And I knew it felt bad immediately, but I couldn't figure out exactly what had happened. That took more reflection. So I sat in my seat reflecting, and it took me a while, but I knew my intention right away. I knew sure the group was not confused about what was written on the slide, and that was a really good thing, right? But that wasn't the biggest thing, actually, whether what on the slide was right or wrong. Really, the problem was that I was racist in doubting her. You might know me and know that I question a lot of things, so you might think it's just part of my personality to question things, and I would agree with you. But when I was sitting there with that pit in my stomach in the moment, I thought, if that was a white, gender-conforming, non-disabled man with a PhD leading the session, I probably wouldn't have interrupted him. I would have really expected he knew what he was talking about, and I would have sat there in my seat and figured out why it was me who was confused. So when there was a break in the workshop, I was, of course, conscious not to interrupt her again. I went over to her and apologized for interrupting and for doubting her. And she kind of brushed it off and said it was fine. I immediately felt relief that she wasn't upset with me. But to this day, I keep thinking about how what I did was what many other people do. I've heard it from lots of people of color, particularly women of color, about how they can get their PhD, can literally be the expert on the topic, and they still get challenged all the time. So this episode is really about what I do when I mess up. And as I shared in this example, I look back at myself and ask how this could be my whiteness showing up. And I think I do this because I can change me. I can show up differently next time. It's easy to rationalize that I didn't mean anything by it. I question people all the time. I mean, really, ask my mom. But that doesn't help me resist any norms, and that doesn't work for change. The other thing that I think is really critical is listening to people in minoritized group and looking to them for wisdom about oppression, because they're the ones who experience it. A story about that is I was in a committee meeting about being more inclusive. It was a group of faculty, mostly white people, and we were talking about what we could do at our institution. And I said, listen, we have a list from racially minoritized students saying they want more racially diverse faculty and staff. We don't need white faculty brainstorming. We need to do what has been asked. We need to change our hiring practices, but that makes us uncomfortable, and we don't like it because it upsets the status quo. It's different from what we're used to doing. It shifts the power. So one thing I try and do is listen and elevate voices of people of color, especially when they're not in the room. I can lend my voice to elevate their wisdom.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. I think our technology is back online. I'm not sure what's happening today. Let's move to Beth.
All right. So I think I'm going to share a story. The last stories have been mostly related to training or presentations or classroom kinds of dynamics. So the story that keeps coming to the top for me is actually just in life. It was at my daughter's school at the time. She was in first grade. And I happened to be there for lunch one day. I can't remember why, but I was there at lunchtime, and her class was lining up, getting ready for there's a monitor, a cafeteria monitor, and getting lined up so the teacher could come and get them. And there was a young boy, African-American boy, at the front of the line, and he was, it was typical first grade energy in the whole cafeteria. And he was chatting a little bit, but nothing out of the ordinary. And the cafeteria monitor pointed at him and said, "You go sit over there. Get out of line and go sit down." And I watched it, and he's like, "I didn't do anything." And I'm thinking in my head, he didn't do anything. And the two white girls right behind them continued to talk, and she didn't call them out. The teacher showed up and got the kids, and then the student had to, be pointed out, and he's like, I didn't do anything. And the teacher's like, just come on. And, I saw his shoulders slump and that sort of resignation of like, in first grade. And I just watched the whole thing. And I didn't do anything, and didn't say to the teacher, he's right, he didn't do anything. Or say to the monitor, hey, I'm wondering why you pulled him out, when his behavior was the same as these other folks. And so it was a real, like, in the moment, I do a lot of work on educational equity and disparate discipline and all those things, and I watched it happen. And all of the systems, right, of school and the messages about who's in charge and all these things, I just didn't say a word, and thought a lot about why and what stopped me, and the worries I had about, well, if I say something, how will that, affect my daughter, which are not realistic worries. But afterwards, I did, eventually I did do something. I talked to the principal, but in that moment, I failed that kid. And so I carry that with me all the time.
Thanks for sharing, Beth. Jessica.
I'm resonating with the I carry it with me all the time. In prepping for this, I was noticing first that I have so many different examples to choose from. And I went to some humor place of like, oh, I have so many. And then I kind of instantly got to this, look how good at this self-reflection I am, that I have tracked so many examples. So then I kind of got to this self-righteous place. And then I realized of the so many examples I'm pulling from, there are millions of examples I didn't even notice, right? So that humbled me pretty quick. So the example that I'm going to share today was in a context of a training, and I've never been anything but a white woman, so I don't know if this is being a cis woman or this is being white or this is being Jessica, but it seems pretty white to me. So I was at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I was working with a large group, auditorium style, kind of wrapped around me. I'm low, and it was towards the end. So we were doing kind of like application Q&As, and one student who I'd called on was challenging me politically, which I'm used to, and that was a white male student. And then a woman of color made a comment, and then there was 2 hands up on the left side of the room, and we really didn't have time for 2 comments in order to end on time. And I wanted to take one of them, and I was debating between a white woman and what looked to be an Asian man. And so I went with the Asian man student to say it. And in my head, I went with him because I knew in my head that I would have to repeat what he said to make sure that everyone in the room would be able to understand him. So then he begins to speak, and he's like California surfer accent, not any kind of Asian accent that I was expecting. I don't even know what an Asian accent means, but I did not have to repeat him at all. And I also was so stunned that I didn't have to repeat him at all. I also did not hear anything that he said. And I just said, I had just done a 3-hour like self-reflection, being aware, noticing social justice, power, privilege conversation. And so I just said, like, can I just pause for a second? And then I decided to be super transparent, because I think as a trainer, it's important to be like in the moment. And so I just said, like, sir, I'm really sorry. I was not able to understand anything that you said, because in my head, I was shocked that you didn't have an accent that I was going to have to translate for the whole room. Do you mind saying it again? And he kind of sat back and just said, thank you for saying that. And I was not anticipating that. And then immediately in my head went, why is this person of color rescuing me from doing something terrible? And he just said, you know, it's interesting is almost nobody ever calls on me anyway. And then when they do, they won't admit that they couldn't hear me, even though I don't have an accent. And we ended up having a really good conversation about it. And then he repeated what his point was. And to this day, there's a part of me was that a good ending of my training point, which this is now like 6 years ago. And another one was that the power of me being vulnerable and truthful about what I said gave him the opportunity to be really vulnerable and powerful with what it's like to never be called on. And then when he is called on, he's never heard. Right? So that's the example I landed on.
Thanks, Jessica. Craig Alamo.
Yeah, so my story is a story about invisibility, and maybe even just to tie it into my intro, thinking about how I neglected to share, thinking about my cisgender privilege or transphobia sort of bubbling up already and neglecting to share my pronouns. So my pronouns are he, him, his, and dude. And let me tell you a little bit about my mess up, or sort of more accurately, the way my racism sort of bubbled up in the context of a training of trainers. So this training of trainers, and this particular mess up or bubble up happened on the second or the third day of a 12-day training of trainers. It's taking place over the course of a month. Was preparing volunteers to facilitate social justice educational workshops. So kind of like Keith's story, a piece around like an auspicious time to do this, right? So I was on a team of 4 folks. My co-facilitators were all folks of color, a mixed racial person, 2 African Americans. And one of my mess ups during this training occurred when during the training, our co-facilitator team was working with the dynamic of the group in the room. On the second day, a number of questions sort of surfaced, and we were pulling in some content and some activities that we had planned to do later on in the 12-day training, and sort of taking things in, taking things out of the design, sort of juggling all that around. Well, near the end of the day, was working with PowerPoint and sort of summarizing all the things that we did for that day, and put it on a nice PowerPoint so I could use that as a way to sort of summarize as sort of the second to last thing we did before we checked out. And after we were done checking out and the group left, a practice that our facilitator team did was we got together and we would talk about how the day went and sort of debrief the day. And, at the end of the day, and maybe before we got into this meeting, I was feeling pretty good about how we as a facilitator team worked, how we juggled all this content and sort of pulled things out and dropped some things based on where we were and our group was. So feeling kind of competent and sort of a little bit of a sense of accomplishment. And right away in our debrief, African-American woman that was a part of the team confronted me almost immediately and said to me, "I can't believe you didn't include the summary of learning for the day, for the part of the day that I led. I felt like you made me and the work that we did during that section invalidated, and I felt invisible. I don't know if it was chauvinism or racism or what, but I felt silenced." So, and of course she was right. I didn't include the portion of her part of the day on the slide. So I immediately felt shame. I felt my stomach drop, sort of rush of blood to my head. Felt pretty darn embarrassed, sort of de-skilled, as Kathy O'Bear might say, and ashamed of, after a good, 10, 20 seconds, after I came to my senses, I immediately apologized, and what I thought about a way that I could be accountable, one of the ways I suggested and did the following day was to re-summarize the day when we started the next day and pointed out that I neglected this person's portion of the day and how that is an example of bad facilitation, right? But I don't think I mentioned a race dynamic or a gender dynamic at all. So, I checked in with my co-facilitator later, and she said it was fine. I wasn't necessarily convinced, and her body language didn't necessarily communicate that to me either. So that there's more to it, but that's sort of essentially the mess up. And some of the pieces I'm taken from I've been reflecting on this a lot is, obviously we don't want to replicate the type of dynamics in society in our co-facilitator team when we're doing social justice educational work, right? So particularly as a cisgender, white, mostly heterosexual, mostly male, and other privileged identities person, I'm replicating stuff that I don't want to see in society, which is really messed up. So sort of being accountable and taking the time ahead of time to really work on relationships and norms within co-facilitator teams. But maybe the biggest thing I've been reflecting on most for several years about not only this incident, but other mess ups or times when I have acted in racist ways more accurately is, and it sounds a little trite, but thinking about trust and how we trust each other from folks from minoritized groups, from privileged groups, and to be able to engage in behaviors that are trustworthy, to be accountable and take responsibility for these times when we mess up. And so the folks that I'm working with can evaluate whether they want to continue to work with me or not. I think Craig mentioned earlier about the sort of relationship ending piece that sort of really resonated with me, and to be really transparent about that. So as a white person, as a social justice educator doing this work, some of the things I'm thinking about is how do I put this about never sort of being in a place where I expect folks of color to trust me, and that might seem like a negative worldview. I don't but I think it will keep me on me and my behaviors on the side of justice, right? To be able to continue to work towards never assuming that I've actually gained that trust and continue to behave in ways that are trustworthy. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Craig. Elaine.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My pronouns are she, her, hers that I use. So there's many stories. I wanted to start with one that is about a workshop that 3 colleagues and I co-facilitated. So there were 4 of us total years ago and I don't say years ago to get myself off the hook for messing up. It just happened to be a long time ago, but it's a powerful example. It was a workshop on the N-word, and it's important to note that the 2 colleagues and friends who are women of color, and then there was myself, a white woman, and a white cis man, a white cis woman, and a white cis man. And both of the women are African heritage. One's Black African American, one's Black Afro-Caribbean. It was their idea. And this was outside the coursework. It was, grad school is incredibly all-consuming. They were both doctoral students, and this was above and beyond. They decided it turned into a full day workshop on the N-word, the history of the N-word, how we work with it in education. It was open to K through 12 educators, those in higher ed, student affairs, people who are already in the field practicing full-time, people who are graduate students, and they figured out a way, my 2 colleagues, to also have there be credit so that people could, for example, teachers, K through 12 teachers could take the workshop and get continuing education or professional development credit. So there's a lot I could say about this. We all put a lot of work into it, and my 2 colleagues that are people of color for sure put more work into it, and asked myself and our other colleague who's white to join them. Partially that was grounded and rooted in this very common in the social justice world, right? And definitely in our graduate program, the social justice program, of this model of, for example, anything around race, racism, whiteness, white supremacy, a white person and a person of color, or in this case, 2 people of color and 2 white people. And there's much to say. They actually wrote an article about it, my 2 colleagues. And there was a point when we were getting close to ready to do the day where there was going to be an exercise in this, again, full 8-hour day, intensive workshop, and a very intense, historically rooted, loaded with trauma topic, where they were going to ask the word to be said out loud repeatedly. And it was part of an exercise, basically. And to make a long story short, they asked myself and my other white colleague to say the word. And I still remember the feeling in my body to say it out loud in the room. and to say it repeatedly as part of the workshop. And everything in me, and the reason I decided to use this example is we have this checklist in our heads often, right, as white people and white educators and allies doing this work of the good things to do and the bad things to do and the things we're supposed to do and the right things and the wrong things. And this binary of right, wrong, even messing up, not messing up, doing it right, not doing it right, for me, I found it can lock me in and leave me less open and flexible to what is needed in the moment, right? And doing this work, we have to be creative and flexible and vulnerable and humble and brave and willing, and which I really appreciate today because that's what's happening, I feel like. So I froze. I was extremely uncomfortable because it's uncomfortable. Of course I was uncomfortable, and just sat with my dominance, the incredible amount of privilege and dominance that I would get to choose whether to say that word or not, when my beloved friends and colleagues and people historically, innumerable people of African descent, were at the hands of extreme violence and even death, and taunting and teasing and bullying and discrimination, at the sound of that word. And so it rose, all that dominance was in me, in the room, and we worked with it. And so I think what I want to say is that I still work with that. I keep working with that. It's not something to fix in the moment. I did what I needed to do internally to apologize for my hesitation and say, and follow the leadership, not in a passive, just tell me what to do way, but I'm with you and we're going to do this in solidarity way. And said it as many times as was asked and was needed to say it in that incredibly powerful workshop. And I just want to close quickly, and there was lots more there, of course. And I talked with one of the two colleagues last night and just said, I just want to run by you because you published on this, and you know how you'd feel about me sharing this tomorrow. And she's like, well, we did write an article on it, Elaine. I'm like, true, good point. It's out there. I feel like it's so important to name that it was their idea. You know, typically when I facilitate, when I've gotten an idea, a word, a phrase, anything from a person of color, to speak that person's name, to give credit where credit is due, because it's taken away so often. So just lastly, in speaking about the mass shootings in Orlando, many of us in Northampton, where I live, gathered that night, Sunday night, when many of us found out, and I was being interviewed by a reporter after, and made reference in my effort to be in solidarity with Muslim people and to call out Islamophobia and show that, look, you know, I identify as queer, that people of different identities can be in solidarity with each other, and wanted to make sure to say, you know, you're not going to pull us into the anti-racist. I'm not playing that game. I said, you know, just last night I was at the graduation party of dear friends who are Muslim, Palestinian Muslims locally, their daughter's high school graduation, and there were so many queer people there, and it's about authentic relationships and real relationships. And then the woman said, oh, can I have their names? What are the names of the two Muslim people? And I wasn't expecting that. And so it's like, you got to think on your feet in the moment, and said, you cannot just put their names in the paper. It might not feel safe right now. And so I made her shake my hand and promise me that if I gave only their emails, that she would not put their names in the paper without their permission. So my point is, it's messy, it's complex, it's nuanced, and we have to stay fresh and willing and honest.
Awesome, thank you all. So just a thought and a noting for us as we shift from our stories to our reflection. So thank you for the stories. I think that's a critical component about us talking about this publicly and in our messiness and vulnerability. But I also I note that we are all, and myself included, talking about our mistakes as mess ups, rather than them really being us acting out of our privilege. I think we want to have our mistakes be seen as mistakes because they're unconscious and we're not trying to do them, but really we're acting out of our whiteness. And so how do we get beyond of us saying, yeah, I've got a mistake too, I've got a mistake here, and get us to how do we hold each other accountable? How do we move to action? How do we create change? How do we get out of our colonization? And so that's a question for us to discuss.
Well, I'll jump in on that, Craig. I think that's a challenge. I think I find myself, even with this conversation, there's some comments on Twitter about should there be a moderator as a person of color as a moderator, which I think that accountability is super important. But then I also don't want to put the onus on people of color to do that work, which is also true. And then one of the things that I find, and Cody Keith Charles was the one who put that out there, so I want to acknowledge him. But I find what I get caught up in is I can be paralyzed by the in-between. I could do this, or I could do this, I could do this, and then I end up doing nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And
which is whiteness.
I think that's it. What was that?
Which is whiteness.
Yeah, and it is safe. Right. And I think I'm often noticing that I'm paralyzed to inaction by a fear of my own racism showing up.
Right. I see other heads nodding, so there's a lot of people that are feeling that same thing.
It just took me, I'm not very good with technology, so it took me a second to unmute. I think that what's also really critical is that my way of being, if this goes back to Keith's point of guilt and shame, etc., is that it is my responsibility to take responsibility for how I show up, and the sliver of how I consciously show up, being reflective and taking responsibility for that, while also knowing that there's tons of stuff that I'm doing unconsciously, but that the act of showing up in a place that I'm prepared and open for my own noticings, or possibly other people, if they're benevolent enough to even push me in a direction to learn. I think that that's key, and it's not a mess up in the sense of even the term mess up is very white, right? I've heard people say we messed up when we went to Iraq. What? No, I'm not. You can't dismiss it in that sense. And so I think that the concept also with the title of the well-intentioned. Right. With our stories, I think that there's not just a shared impact on in these particular cases, the folks of color that we've been sharing, but also the impact that has happened to us on the few instances that we were conscious, right? And so, and then the unconscious piece has this overwhelming impact that just keeps us going as we are in our places of privilege and our places of power.
And I think just to answer my own question, I add that this is work that I need to do for me and for the rest of us white people. This is not work that I need to do for my friends and colleagues or whatnot. This is about me interrupting my own whiteness and internalized dominance and colonization, so that I can live in a better way. And I appreciate your point, Jess, where you talk about it's about being prepared, but it's also me being prepared, similar to what Beth's story was. When I take my kids to school, when I'm at the coffee shop, it's all those other moments when I'm not on that I need to be able to, that's my reminder about how I have not yet fully completed the work that I need to do. It's when those moments when I don't see myself as being on, and it comes back up.
Yeah. I was just going to say I agree with that, and I was resonating with what you said, Jess. This idea of mess up, the stories that I carry with me I really think of as failures, and which goes with that whole whiteness piece around perfection and how do you show up and things like that. But there are places where I failed myself, most of all in the ways that Craig was talking about, and I think connected to that then are all the places where I failed that I don't know about, like you were saying, because I think Craig Alamo used the idea of gift, no one gifted me with saying, hey, you totally messed that up. But most of the time I failed because I totally I recognized what was going on, and I recognized that I was either the behavior that I was engaging in, and then I fail again because I get scared or immobilized and then don't just say, hey, this is what's happening, right? And be willing to admit it. So there's like the failure, and then the hoping no one else noticed the failure. And those are the things that I carry the most. And I hope that other people connect with that instinct.
And I think that one step further, which is implied, but I think needs to be named, is that our learning moments, my learning moment, is a real person's survival of yet another act of violence that I'm responsible for.
Right.
Another compounding pile-up action of pain. That when you reference the little boy in first grade with the slumped shoulders, that's not the first or the last time that's going to happen to that kid, right? And the responsibility we have, whether conscious or unconscious, that by virtue of benefiting for a privilege is an act of violence. And if we take that with the degree of seriousness, even some of the time, that is going to be way better than never acknowledging that my casually walking around a grocery store is something that not everybody can do. Mm-hmm. And Craig Elliott, what I was going to say with you, in that one of the things I challenged myself to do a while ago was not just to be in training mode when I'm at work, but for the habit to stick to what I call like cantaloupe moments. So that when I'm in the grocery store buying a cantaloupe, I'm not doing the work, but I'm being the evidence or the results of my work, which are both disgusting and some I'm proud of.
Right.
In those cantaloupe moments, that's where privilege really shows up. Sorry, Craig.
No, I was just echoing that. I mean, you're right on about that, and it reminds me of Dr. Becky Martinez's phrase. It's being and not doing. You know, I think whiteness has us be that we have to act, we have to show up, and we have to carry the coffee mug and the poster, and have to write the books, and that's all about us doing and performing this idea. And what you're talking about, and what Dr. Martinez talks about, is how are we being this in our lives in every moment.
I'm listening to all this, and I'm reading some of the Twitter back channel about something feeling kind of off, and how in this webinar, and how it's white people talking about their mistakes as points of pride. And it leads me to think about when Heather opened up telling the story and how she wanted to fix her mistake. And that resonates a lot with me, that something happens, I do something, and then I want to fix it, as if I can fix things, as if I have that much control, as if people of color haven't been trying to fix things for hundreds of years, and then I'm going to come in as the magical savior white woman and fix it all. And so I feel like our intention with this webinar is to be vulnerable and talking about how we don't have it all figured out, and how we messed up and there it is again, how we're racist, and how we what strategies we use to show up differently. And it sounds like the impact of us doing that is that we're, again, sharing our stories and all the work that we do, and not giving as much attention to the work that people of color are doing all the time, because they have to survive.
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe just a share. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to ask Elaine if she had something that feels like what she wanted to add would fit here well.
Sure. I just wanted to say something about relationships, and when this is messy. It's messy, and I was just reflecting too that it feels often awkward and strange. Often it feels risky to even say that when white people are gathered talking about whiteness, because something is very off with whiteness. Whiteness is off. It's not whiteness, white supremacy, racism, and when we're calling attention to it and really putting our focus and attention on it, often the energy is up in this very bizarre way because the whole system is trying to get us not to do that.
Right.
We're not supposed to do that. We're not supposed to call it out, name it, talk about it, work with it so overtly. And so often, I'll speak for myself, it can feel awkward, it's messy, and it can feel like we're just a bunch of white, people sitting around navel gazing. And so that's real, and we can talk about that too. And that certainly isn't the intention of any of us. I think it's safe to say it's to pull the curtain back. It's to name it and talk about it so that we can dismantle it and work for transformation and liberation. And that this so much, I'll just lastly say that it's about authentic relationships with each other as fellow white people doing anti-racist, pro-liberation work, and with people of color. And that sustained authentic relationships, as we know, are messy and take time and commitment and work and joy too, and staying in it for the long haul. And that's what this work is about ultimately. The older I get, the more I'm like, it's about relationships and coming and doing what's necessary to keep coming back.
Right. Keep
showing up.
So I know we have 5 minutes left, and I have a question for us about it's a privilege. It's more white privilege if all we do after having this conversation is we go back and do the same thing. So I think what is our commitment? What are we going to do as soon as we hang up from this webinar to go shift ourselves out of white privilege and show up differently?
And I'll add to that. Cody Keith Charles mentioned, how much risk are you willing to take?
Yeah.
And are we willing to critique the organizations that offer us a platform?
Right. Great question, Cody. So I'll start. The thing I'm going to do when I get done with this is I'm going to go and have the conversation that I've been needing to have in my organization about how we continue to marginalize students of color in our admission process and in our academic spaces. So that is the conversation that we've been talking around for a long time, and so that's the one I'm going to go have.
As someone who's new, in a new position on a new campus, one of the things I've been trying to do, and I don't know how successful I am at doing this, but as I am engaging with my colleagues of color to name the privileges that I have, talk about the ways in which I am trying to work in ways that is towards justice, and to also name that I know that I'm going to mess up and ask for help. Not to put burden on other folks, but the ways in which that, if it's appropriate, if folks don't feel burdened, that I hope that the relationships that we're building are ones where we can be in dialogue and be able to trust each other and to give feedback when appropriate.
I'll go next. My promise and commitment is to continue listening to other white folks that are challenging me. Also, the experts on how whiteness shows up are usually people who are not white, and remaining open to the actual experts of what it does mean to be white, without getting defensive, without coming up with perfectly logical explanations as to why things are happening, or dismissing expertise of communities that experience what I'm unconscious to. And then as far as other organizations and things that I do have the privilege to work with, I have and will continue being comfortable challenging the slate of people that are coming in over the years, what kind of topics are not being covered, what is being asked, and turning down work that I call kind of checkbox programs that aren't actually supposed to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
I don't do that kind of work.
Right.
So this has been great. Thank you.
Taking the feedback that we get from our colleagues of color and acting on it too, when we do mess up, when we do act in ways or see ways in which we could maybe leverage our privileges in ways that could be helpful.
Right.
I've been keeping a running list of the need for behavioral amends. I don't know why I'm putting in air quotes, behavioral amends to people of color in my life. Sometimes it's concrete and tangible and seemingly small. Sometimes it's a bigger, more nuanced, hard to put your finger on thing. Sometimes it's a task. So I've been keeping a list, and I have it on my to-do list this weekend to contact a white colleague, friend, fellow ally, and say, do you want to kind of partner on this and help keep each other accountability, like an accountability partner. So I commit to doing that so that I can keep up with the behavioral amends and hopefully decrease the list. Yeah.
I think for me, it's just about further learning about how my racism shows up in ways that I'm not aware, and making myself more aware of that, which is really painful, but really critical to people who I'm in community with and to myself. I think it's all of that.
I'm committed to paying attention to the work I ask people of color to do, and making sure that I'm doing my work and also being in partnership with people of color.
I know we're running out of time, and I'll be honest, I'm sort of stuck in this place where can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Stuck in this place of, well, I have to say something because everybody expects everyone to say something, but I also don't want to repeat what other people said. And so I will be borrowing from all of the things that people have already committed to, and finding ways to do that in all aspects of my life.
Awesome. I think the key is bringing back up some of the points that I think I've been reading on the Twitter comments today. And I think if anybody who's watching this as a recording, we will post that transcript if possible, because I think the key learning that I'm gaining from this is in hearing from my colleagues via their tweets today. So thank you to all of you who are participating in the back channel. And particularly, I think the comment about recentering people of color as experts around whiteness, because their experience is, as one of you just said, is the most relevant, right? And so we need to have this conversation among white people, but we can't not also include people of color. So thank you to the other 7 people who joined the conversation today, sharing your stories. I think I am hopeful that this, as all of the episodes are, never the end of the conversation, but just the beginning. And I'm committed to continuing the conversations however they might be possible, or supporting folks who want to lead those conversations, since it may not be me who's the best person to lead them. So moving on to our next episodes, again, thank you to our program sponsors. Next week, just in time for our elections, Tony is going to be back with an episode talking about From Debate to Dialogue, how to talk about hot topics on campus, with Dr. Marcella Runell Hall, Dr. Kelly Maxwell, and Dr. Dimitri Morgan. This is certainly a timely topic given our upcoming elections, among other issues. I'm going to be back in October with an episode on building partnerships between student affairs and campus police. And Keith Edwards is going to be on later in October talking about emotional intelligence in student affairs work. You can learn more about this and all of the episodes on Student Affairs Live by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter. You can also review our episodes in the archives and download our iTunes podcast. Once again, thank you to the other 7 folks joining us today. You all totally rock. I'm going to be thinking about this for days, weeks, maybe the rest of my career. Thanks for watching, everybody. Make it a great week.
Yeah, bye.